I'm David Anderson, and I serve as chair for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the board to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted in hybrid form, with some individuals remote by conference call or other electronic medium, and some individuals present at the board's office. Denise Steinsman.
Here.
Jill Flessing.
Present.
Linda Heitzman Powell.
Present.
Donna Honer Queel. Mary Jones.
Present.
Jim Kilmartin.
Presence.
And Richard will be absent. Andrea Perdomo Morales.
Present.
Cynthia Shindo.
Present.
Laura Shaughnessy.
Present.
David Stevens.
Here.
I note the following staff members are also present. David By. Here. Leslie Allen.
Here.
Tim Resner, serving as legal counsel for the board, is also present. Next, David Fine will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Dave. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the board about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or COMA, does not require the board to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the Executive Director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this meeting publicly in hybrid form, I state for the record the following information. Access to this meeting is conducted in person and by use of medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting in person at the BSRB office or through the use of the conference call or by viewing the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted in hybrid form, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended. As such, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. On October 14th, 2024, we sent notice of the board meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media materials have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of this meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And we did check the conference call line before we got started. No one is currently on the conference call line, but if someone enters the conference call, we will let you know.
Thank you. The meeting is now called to order, and the board will begin its discussion of the first item on its agenda. Just want to welcome everyone. Good to see you all. Our first agenda item is actually approval of the agenda. Are there any additions to the agenda? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion. Thank you, Mary. Second?
Second.
Good, Cynthia. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carried. Public comment.
No individual requested public comment for this meeting.
Okay. We'll move to review and approval of the minutes from the previous board meeting on September 29th and 30th. Any requested changes to the minute? Then I would accept a motion.
So moved.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Thank you. We'll go to the executive director's report.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So I will go ahead and provide a summary of different items recently. First, starting with outreach, every meeting I try to provide the board an update on some of the ways that we're interacting with individuals and helping to get out some of the conversation the board is having and the advisory committees and a lot of the work that's being done. We launched a YouTube channel back in January of 2021. Since that time, we've broadcast live or uploaded somewhere around 180 meetings. They have now been viewed over 10,000 times. We've also had a couple of meetings that were not official board meetings, but we uploaded them as a helpful resource. And two of those were the informational forums we had last month, or I guess the month before, barely, but the end of September for the educators and also for employers. So those are available to be viewed as well. But really happy with that device. It's been a nice tool for us. And when I go to association meetings, I'm always happy to share information about it as a success story. And other individuals, they talk about their boards, they're thinking about trying to have more transparency and more ways to reach people. And so some of them have started broadcasting their meetings too. So in terms of an update on other operations, in terms of outreach, I mentioned before that I've been spending some time this fall working with representatives from the Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services and also the Board of Regents. We had applied for a grant from an entity that provides essentially resources to help address different problems from a health policy perspective. And so one of the issues we were working on together is creative solutions primarily to workforce shortages in the mental health field. And we were able to have a number of different conversations, collect information. One of the big issues, I think, as it affects the BSRB and other licensing boards is that there are different things in play. When we look at our licensing totals over the last 9 years, our number of licensees continues to increase. We keep a running total and report on it every couple of months at every board meeting. And over that time period, we've gone up from 12,000 licensees to 16,000 permanent licenses under the board. But we know that there is still a demand for services. And some of the information that I've collected from some of those meetings has been that since at least 2020, the demand for services is far outpacing how many licensees are joining the field. So it's not, a matter of people are struggling. I mean, some people are struggling to get licensed, but we are still increasing the number of licensees and it's growing by significant measurements. It's just that there is a increased demand for services. And that's, one of the new things that we're seeing over the last few years is that level of increase, that demand is increasing a lot. So we have been collecting information, looking at what areas are struggling the most, and some of the lower level types of practitioners is one of the focuses for that group. So, in the last few years, there's been a shift. And so we used to have a higher number, for example, of, let's say, bachelor social workers. And now we have a higher number of masters and clinical social workers as people are staying in school longer, getting advanced degrees, becoming independent practitioners. But there is still a demand for people at the introductory field services level. And so under the Board of Nursing, there is a type of a practitioner that's a technician that helps out with the mental health hospitals for the state. And there has been some research to kind of see, is this something that can be expanded to more areas to help people start to get a path? There's also been some research that we've been looking at to see, can we provide more resources about what can people do if they get, let's say, a bachelor's level license or a bachelor's level education in psychology. What would be a next step towards another license, or what are the fields they could potentially be working in? So, a lot of these topics don't directly tie to the natural work of the licensing board, but we want to be helpful in these areas, and there is a connection for sure. And so it's been a good partnership working with them, and we're going to continue to meet. And later this fall, I think they might look at possible recommendations for legislature, just from that group that's working there. If not this year, then perhaps next year. But I think the end goal would be hopefully to come up with some recommendations on ways to be helpful in that area. In terms of licensees in particular, one of the other points of discussion has been the difference between how many people are licensed versus how many people are practicing and providing services full time. Utah has done a study where they polled their licensees and they asked them, how many of you are providing direct services, and what is the ratio of direct services that you're providing? because we know that some people hold a license but may work in another field. Some people may work part-time. So how do you quantify that in terms of workforce? And I'm happy to report this is something that we've been proactive on. A lot of the advisory committees have been developing survey questions to try to look at different areas where the board can be helpful. But one of the other areas as well is to try to quantify workforce. And so some of those questions go towards, are you practicing in this field? Are you providing direct services? And if so, how are you providing those services and in what amounts? And so I'm hopeful over the next couple months as we get the results of that survey back from the different licensing groups, we'll have some information that can be helpful to share on this topic as well. Moving next to an update on revenue and expenditures for the agency. So we are a fee-funded agency. We operate by the revenue that we receive from licensing fees. We have one fund in terms of lots of different state agencies. We are one of the smaller agencies, but we work on a balance. We have licensing revenue that comes in, and the legislature sets a limit for how much we can spend every year. And we have our fee fund balance, and whatever we don't spend stays in our fund, so it doesn't go anywhere. So we set the limit. We ask the legislature for a certain amount. The governor can make recommendations. The legislature establishes that. And so we're working on that. The fee fund balance had grown in recent years, looking back to the 2010s. In an effort to draw down the balance in the fee fund, the board lowered a lot of fees significantly back in 2019, dropping the application fees and renewal fees by about $50 each. And that has been helpful to decrease the balance in the fee fund. Our current yearly operating expenditures run about 1.1 million to 1.2 million. The fee fund balance had gotten as high as about 2.3 million, I believe, and now it is down to about 1.8 million. But we are still looking at other efficiencies, and I'll have some updates in terms of other fee-related topics as well. But just wanted to let you know where we're currently at for the fiscal year. We basically started at about 1.8. We are running right around there too, although I don't have the most recent information from October, given how current this meeting is. But I'll provide another update to you at the next meeting. And by that point, we should be about halfway through the fiscal year. Next operations update, want to let you know about how things are going with CE Broker. So in this past year, we have been talking with a company called CE Broker, which assists licensing boards with their ability to audit continuing education hours and assist licensees in finding opportunities for continuing education credits. And so this group works already with the Board of Nursing, Board of Healing Arts. This is a free service for the licensing board. It's also a free service to licensees. They do have some optional paid tiers of membership if people want to pay for additional resources. But what it does is you essentially can activate an account and then be able to upload your documentation to show that you completed your CEs. So if you are pulled for audit at the end of your license period and when you're renewing your license, you can have those already uploaded. So instead of all the communication back and forth, our staff members can log into the portal, verify that you have all of your documents, and then the audit process should go much more smoothly and take less time for everyone involved. It's also a nice benefit for licensees. They don't have to hang on to their paper record for 2 years, not knowing if they'll be audited or not. So we are encouraging people to go ahead and start working with CE Broker. Because of the 7 professions that we regulate, we have started a rollout of a few professions at a time. So the first 2 that were started were social work and professional counseling. And happy to report that that has gone fairly smoothly. We're still working on a couple of technology related type issues with how we kind of describe our licenses. But then starting basically this week, we're also going to have that be opened up for individual licensees for marriage and family therapy and master's level psychology. And then the remaining professions, we will have a rollout period probably sometime in the next few months, ultimately having all of our licensees eligible for CE Broker. It is an optional service. Some states make it mandatory, but we decided as the board to make this an optional benefit to licensees. So no one is forced to do this, but I really do encourage licensees to sign up for it. I think it's a nice resource and a tool. Moving next to some legislative updates. So basically every year concerning the budget for the BSRB, there is a traditional budget cycle. And by about September 15th, or if it falls on a weekend, September 16th, all state agencies have to submit a recommended or requested budget. And they have the current year that they're making revisions to, and then at least one budget year, if not two budget years, that they're requesting expenditures for. This has been submitted to the Division of Budget to review, make technical changes, and then ultimately the governor reviews it, makes recommendations. And then the first week in January, when the session starts, the governor comes out with the recommendation. And then that gets provided to the House and the Senate. They have separate budget committees that review every agency's budget, make recommendations to either concur with the governor's recommendation or make additional changes. And then ultimately, that's decided by both the House and the Senate. It goes into an appropriations bill and then is passed by the legislature. This fall, the legislature is exploring a different process. They are looking at a special interim committee on the budget process to educate themselves on what available resources are there under the law that they could do. And then also there's been discussion about perhaps they would want to put forward a bill to have additional flexibilities in terms of the budget process. One of the topics of conversation has been that when the governor's recommendation is released, in order for everything to be properly qualified and quantified in written form, it takes a few weeks for those summaries to be available for the budget committees. And the legislature has indicated they would like to start on those as soon as they start meeting for the session. And so what the legislature is doing this fall is they've decided they would like to come up with their own budget bill. So the governor will still have a budget bill as part of the recommendation. The legislature will come up with their own recommendation as well and will be introduced in bill form. And just found out on Friday that they are having the first of these special meetings this coming Friday. And I don't know a lot about the process. This is the first time that they have done this, to my knowledge, ever in the state of Kansas. But we are happy to meet any expectation and provide any information. So I have let them know that I'm available for questions. I will find out if this is going to be like the traditional budget hearings where you would submit testimony. But it sounds like they're going to have quite a few budgets in a very limited amount of time. So there may not be an opportunity for the agencies to speak, but I will reach out and happy to answer any questions they might have. But I have been informed that this coming Friday will be the meeting where the BSRB's budget will be considered, and it should be a joint committee of both House and Senate members. Moving next to some updates from associations. I just returned from the annual meeting of the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB. That is a separate agenda item on the agenda, so I'll go ahead and pause on any kind of updates from that. But I wanted to let you all know about a couple of other upcoming annual meetings. The Social Work Association, the Association of Social Work Boards, ASWB, that annual meeting will be taking place November 7th through 9th. So I will be attending that meeting. Cynthia Schindel is also attending that meeting as well. So I will be there with her. And then in the spring, I know it seems like it's a little bit far away, but February is going to come up real quick. There's going to be an annual meeting for the American Association of State Counseling Boards. And so just as a reminder, I'm volunteering for a few different associations to try to give back. They provide us a number of different resources and assistance. And so that's one of the new roles that I've taken on this past year. I'm serving as the treasurer for the AASCB association. So happy to learn more information and take those skills back to help out in this role. But also I'm trying to help them with looking for different ways they can be efficient with their money and maybe increase their passive revenue. So that is going pretty well. In terms of some other updates in your packet of material, you should see an update from Jason Hess. He is the board's representative on the Kansas Fight Addiction Grant Review Board. So you should have his update there. I did ask him if he would be available to speak to the board in person or by remote process, and he had a conflict for this meeting, but he should be available for the January board meeting. So looking forward to that. And then in terms of other topics for updates, there are a number of multi-state compacts that the BSRB is an active member of on behalf of the state of Kansas. The legislation has passed to add Kansas to one for psychologists called SIPAC. The annual meeting for SIPAC will be taking place at the middle to the end of November, November 18th and 19th. So I will be attending that meeting as the SIPAC commissioner for Kansas. And then that role will be changing and shifting to Richard Nobles, and he will take over as the new SIPAC commissioner going forward. And part of that is because I'm trying to dedicate time to the social work multi-state compact. And the board went ahead and determined that I should be the commissioner for the social work multi-state compact. And so I've been attending meetings for that entity to try to help them get up and running and have good rules in place. And their next meeting is going to be February 4th through 5th. And in the meanwhile, the Professional Counseling Multi-State Compact is meeting. They are working on becoming operational as well. And the big item that they're working on right now is a data system, so that when people start having privileges to practice in other states, they'll be able to have a place where we can keep track of all of those. And members of the public will have an access point where they can verify if someone is actually authorized to practice in the state, or if there's an issue with that. Then I have a number of other items on there, but you can just go ahead and take a look. We do staff the regular committees, and then I attend other entity meetings as well. Just a couple of notes from some of those meetings. I have tried to take another step forward in terms of connecting to some of the associations here in the state for the professions that we regulate. So you might see a couple of meetings on there with representatives from the Kansas Counseling Association and the Kansas Psychological Association, trying to set up routine conversations meetings, and just trying to be intentional about making sure that we have good dialogue between organizations. I've also reached out to the Behavior Analyst Organization and also NASW Kansas. So trying to start up those meetings and just make them a regular point. But then when we have items of focus, we can have good communication as far as that goes as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Dave. Any questions for Dave? Okay, and we'll move on to the update from the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Board.
Okay, so as I mentioned, just got back literally last night. Got back to Topeka around 10 p.m. There was a little bit of weather with some delays, but thankfully nothing too bad. And it was a very productive meeting. So I attended this meeting. Also, Linda Heitzman Powell was in attendance at the annual meeting as well in Dallas, Texas. And you may recall that the board had voted and asked that on behalf of Kansas, we bring forward a position on a proposed bylaw amendment. And so for the psychology profession, their test is known as the EPPP. And over the last few years, they have developed a test called the EPPP2. And the way that those tests are described is that the EPPP has been the licensing test for a number of years. The way that the association would describe it is that it is a test of knowledge, and the EPPP2 was created out of a demand from agencies or requests from agencies to have more of a standardized measure of competency. In previous years, some of the different states had oral examinations as a way to measure competency, but they had come under attack for having some bias to them. And so they created the EPPP2 as sort of an answer to that as a standardized measure of competence. A few years back, they decided to open that up for states to voluntarily adopt if they would like to make it a requirement for licensure. And 2 states have, I believe it's Georgia and Nevada, and then a few different Canadian provinces and a couple of territories have as well. But the majority of states have not. And in the fall of 2022, the board of ASPPB voted to go ahead and say if any states or jurisdictions want to use that licensing examination after January 1st of 2026, they will need to require passage of the EPPP as well as the EPPP Part 2. And they would be renaming the examinations the EPPP Part 1 and EPPP Part 2, and saying that they are both 2 parts of one test going forward. So you don't have to use the test. Any jurisdiction can use whatever measurement they want to for licensure. But if you wish to use that test, that was one of the requirements. At that time, the board had received a couple of comments from the public members or from public individuals asking for the board to vote against that measurement. The issue was that it never became before the members. It was never something that the members of ASPPB as states and jurisdictions were asked to vote on. Should this be something going forward? It was the position of the ASPPB board at the time that this was important in terms of being able to assess knowledge and competency. And so it was voted on by the board, and then we were informed about this, so there was the opportunity for questions. And at that time, I had concerns. It felt strange not having a vote by the board, but Um, you know, everybody moved forward with hesitation. And as we got closer to that date, a number of states were looking at how this could be implemented and whether it actually could be implemented by that date. And one of the issues that Texas was having was their test is specifically identified in their statutes. And they did not believe that the legislature was going to approve for them to add a requirement of another test for a number of different reasons. And so what it presented for them was that as of January 1st, 2026, if they couldn't require passage of EPPP2, they would no longer be able to use EPPP and would essentially be left without a licensing examination. And they were not the only state that was kind of running into that issue, but they talked with ASPPB. They said this was an issue. We've had some other meetings where people have addressed concerns, but the board had really held with that position that it still was going to be a requirement. And so over the last, say, 6 months or so, representatives from Texas decided to start thinking creatively and try some different methods. And so one of the methods was potentially to amend the bylaws for the association to essentially say no state or province will be required to use the test as a condition of association membership. And the association would have to have a separate knowledge-based test from a skills-based test, and no jurisdiction would be required to require passage of both of them. The idea being that they wanted every state to have the opportunity to choose whether to require it or not. And they thought that passing this bylaw amendment would be the mechanism to do that. And so when this was brought to Kansas and a number of other states, we took it to the board, and the board referred it to the advisory committee for licensed psychology and master's level psychology to discuss. And for our psychology advisory committee, we even asked the representatives from the association, the staff, to come and talk through the development of the test for the EPPP as well as the EPPP2, and to discuss the origins and the reasons why this happened. Not basically asking them why they made this decision, because that was made by the board of the association, but just to kind of educate the members. And that advisory committee and the master's level advisory committee had a discussion and identified significant concerns with requiring both parts of the test. Included in this was concerns about the cost element. There'd be a cost for both parts, $600 and I believe $450. It could be perceived that this would be a barrier to licensure, because there might be some people that would pass the first test and not be able to pass the second test, or it would at least delay individuals. Also, the concept of being able to make a decision for each state is a thing that people were open to, that would be a good option. Nothing against the test per se. There are going to be states that would want to use that, but if it's a requirement, that takes it out of the flexibility for different states to make that decision. And then also, in working through this, while we may not be in that position that Texas is in specifically, we are all members of that association. And we would hope that if we were in a similar situation, other people would come to our assistance if we had an issue like this as well. So the board was asked by the advisory committees to take a position to support this bylaw amendment. And at the board meeting, the board voted at the end of September and voted to support the bylaw amendment. So when Linda and I went to the association meeting, we were ready to vote in favor of the bylaw amendment. In your packet of material, there is a letter from ASPPB. It's dated October 22nd. So this came out just a little bit less than a week before the annual meeting. And it is called A New Path Forward, Prioritizing Resolution Over Conflict. And it talks about a shift in position. And so in leading up to this annual meeting, representatives from Texas had a number of forums to educate individuals about their bylaw amendment, to get responses back, and basically to see if individuals were supportive of the amendment. And from talking to different states, there were a number of different states that were supportive of the amendment, and some jurisdictions that maybe didn't normally send a representative to the association meeting, they were planning to send someone there specifically to weigh in on this conversation. And so the board of ASPPB had a meeting about a week before the meeting, and they decided that they were going to pause the requirement that there would be a requirement of both tests as of January 1st, 2026. And so they also talked about wanting to form a new way forward with having a more integrated test. They still saw the value in assessing skills, but they said that they would like to work more with the members and bring back something that would be more palatable and something that more people would be supportive of. And so this was all the foundation going into that meeting. Now, in that meeting, I did speak to the board publicly, and I said, could you define the word pause? Because, you trust, but anything paused can be unpaused. And so is this something where there could be a temporary pause and then we would lose the opportunity for this to be resolved and then people would be back in the same situation? But they said no, that may have been a poor word choice. Their intention was not to temporarily pause it. Their intention was really just take a pause in this approach to take a step back and rethink this process. And so multiple members of the board aired that as their feeling. And so I do think that is sincerely what they are planning to do. And they did talk about wanting to put something out in December to recruit individuals to be on a new committee or how this should go forward moving, in the future. Putting together a new test, kind of creating that examination. So that is something in the future. At the meeting, there was still the matter of should the bylaw amendment go forward. There was this letter from the board, but the members still had not had the opportunity to vote. There were concerns that were raised. There was listening sessions, but the members had not voted on anything. And so it was a decision by Texas to go ahead and still carry this forward. And so there was an opportunity to vote on the bylaw amendment. Some individuals said, I came to this meeting to vote against it, but with this new information, I'm uncertain how my board would vote. And so I'd like to take this back. So there was a motion to postpone the vote until sometime in the early spring. Unfortunately, that didn't have enough votes to be passed, so it was back on the motion. There was a motion by people who opposed it to just withdraw the bylaw proposed amendment, and that didn't have enough votes. So it returned to the actual motion itself, and by a vote of, I believe it was 12 votes in favor of the bylaw amendment and about 29 against, it failed. And so I can't say why everyone voted the way they did, but it did fail. What that means going forward, though, is with the comments by the board, I think they were planning on rethinking this process. But I think some people, I think what this kind of brought up for me and listening to all the states, and I really spent a lot of time at this meeting talking to board members, talking to other people from states, figuring out where this association should go moving forward. And I think right now there's a lot of unhappiness with the ability to vote on important matters. So I think in general, this is something where probably the bylaws for the association need to be reviewed, and the membership needs to look and say, do you like your level of ability to vote on measures, or could there be procedural changes? I think that's one thing. And there's a number of other items too. Board members are delegated certain responsibilities in a lot of organizations, but there's a question of the members want to vote or should it be the board? And so an association like this, I think the members are taking a more active role. And I think in terms of the discussion, it was really productive to hear all the different positions. And I think people really gained insight into other perspectives. So I took a lot of positive things from this, but there were certainly a lot of tense moments. So now this was just one part of the meeting, but Linda, do you have any comments on that part of it or anything else you wanted to say about the conference?
Well, with regards to that piece specifically, it was a great opportunity to view democracy in progress. And I think it was all facets of it. I heard in between from not within that specific time, but from outside of that particular meeting, that there had been social media posts that were specifically targeting some of the board members and their decision, which sort of mirrors what's going on in the country as a whole, right? And so it very much was a microcosm of democracy and the current climate in the United States. And so people were able to get past that. They came, they discussed, they presented their different sides, the vote was taken, and we moved on with the conference. And so the only thing that I take exception to is the somewhat personal attacks that came out of that. I wish that had not happened, but the process as a whole was very democratic. I thoroughly enjoyed that part of it. As a whole, there were some other things that were discussed, specifically around, like David was saying earlier in his report, the workforce development challenge that we're experiencing nationwide. And there are a number of states that are really considering, and APA is really considering, looking at the master's level clinicians and what they can do and what they cannot do, and whether or not they can be independent or they need to be fully supervised. And there was a range of options that were presented at that. And I thought that was really interesting and informative about the number of states that are considering that master's level licensure. And finally, there was a presentation by one of our partner sites in Canada about social media. Gosh, it was a really good conference. And talking about some of the things that had been posted on a psychologist's site like X or Facebook, where that person was representing themselves as a psychologist and as a member of that association, and were saying very controversial and demeaning things about certain segments of society, and the ensuing legal battle. And they were fee funded as well, and how much it cost for that. So that was very eye-opening and informative. And finally, we had a really robust presentation on AI, which seems to be something that people are thinking about nationally. So it was a great learning opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, and the only other topic that I would say is prescriptive authority.
Yeah.
From a number of states that are considering legislation on that topic. And that was interesting because I have not heard a lot recently around here, but I did hear that from multiple states that they were at least looking at that as a way to address being able to provide services, and especially in rural areas. But I did want to let you know, in terms of our vote, we did explain, or I brought that forward. I voted for the bylaw amendment as the board had asked me to do, understanding the complexity of having this letter and trying to figure out where it goes. But given some of the concerns that were raised by the board, and I communicated this to the microphone to explain my vote, I said, there were concerns that were raised, and we have this letter, and I like the message the board is putting out, but I can't say for certain that letter addresses all the concerns that were raised by individuals in terms of board membership. So without the opportunity to bring it back before the board and see if the board still, wanted to go forward, or if they wanted to change their position, I was going to go ahead and vote the way that the board had directed me to vote. So that's what I did. But yeah, I agree with Linda. It was a very good conference. There is a section of the meeting which is for administrators or executive directors to have conversations with each other and learn about what's going on in every jurisdiction. A couple of the takeaways from that I thought were interesting. I was able to collect a little bit of information in terms of, the legislature has talked about our fee fund balance and our yearly expenditures. And there was one state, I believe it was Arkansas, where they had a significant decrease in their licensing fees as a way to draw down the balance in their fee funds. But the end goal was that the fee fund balance would be 3 years expenditures for the agency. We are about 1.8 million, even though our expenditures are 1.1 million for the year. So we are far under that, but that was their end goal, is to reduce it just to get down to 3 years of operating costs. There was another one who basically said their legislature looked at a range between, I think it was 75 to 125% of their annual budget. So I do think if we have our fee fund balance down to about 1 year of expenditures, that definitely seems to be on the low end, knowing that there are some other states that have much higher fee fund balances that they have used as their target. So just kind of wanted to let you know about that. It's always nice to hear outside perspectives. You sometimes hear about what states are doing. I think Oregon made fees 0 for 1 year as a way to do that. But then when they did that, they didn't adjust staffing at all. And it created a 6-month licensing delay. because they had such an influx of out-of-state people who wanted to get a free license that they just said, okay, we'll all go and take that opportunity, but then the licensing staff, it wasn't sufficient for that influx, and so it created issues for people inside the state and outside the state. So you don't always get the full story on those things.
The question on that, on the operating budget though, is as you look at what your balance could be or what you'd like it to be, do you consider the fact that operating expenses just go up over time?
Some of them do. Yeah. We're seeing inflationary costs. For example, staff have Microsoft Office account, and every year they just tell us what that's going to be, and it keeps just going up and up. And so I think in general, it can be expected that they're going to go up, and thankfully, and there's good reasons why some of those increase as well. The legislature did improve some salary increases for staff members recently. They looked at workforce and did a study of positions, and if they were under market, they tried to bring some of those up, which I'm very happy about. So we're spending more money for that purpose. Happy to have the staff members compensated in a better way. But yeah, some of those things are just inflationary costs. There's no way around. But then again, if I can look for efficiencies once that number is set, I never want to spend up to the limit. I always want to get the limit established based on projected costs. And then if I can get under that, I always try to. And I will say in the revised budget that I submitted this time around, sometimes there is a encouragement that if you have an amount, just go ahead and as long as you don't have substantial changes, to go ahead and resubmit for the approved amount, and then in out years take into consideration inflationary type adjustments. But we actually had come in a little bit under budget for this current year. So the revised budget, it wasn't a lot, but it did come in. I submitted it just a little under what we had been approved for. So I'm hoping they recognize that as a good faith gesture, that we're not asking to spend as much as we can. We're really trying to make this a accurate target.
We still don't know yet the impact the compacts will have. So that's one of the reasons we've been a little cautious about how much we're spending that down.
Yeah, social work, as it looks like it could become effective or implemented maybe late next year, if they get the licensing, the data system. And then professional counseling, they're targeting August or September of next year. But we anticipate that, this will help out individual licensees in different states because they won't need to get a license everywhere they want to practice. It provides alternatives for that. However, for licensing boards, we're used to operating at a balance. And so if individuals are spending less on licenses, that means less revenue. And so you have to rebalance and try to figure out how that's going to work.
So Dave, just for clarification on the ASPPB, even though the Texas amendment failed, they took the feedback they were getting and are still deciding to pause moving forward with requiring both the EPPP1 and 2.
Yes, that is the big takeaway for sure, is that as of January 1st, 2026, we will not be required to have licensed applicants pass both EPPP and the EPPP2. Even though the bylaw amendment failed, I believe some people voted against it because of the message from the board and wanting to demonstrate good faith that the board had described instead of having it as a mechanism to kind of, have it be settled that way. So
Very good.
But a really positive thing, I think it opened up board members' eyes for sure to some of the concerns from the states, and it changed their position in terms of working with members in terms of finding a good solution.
Thank you, Dave. Any other questions? All right, we'll move on to staff reports.
I'm gonna do it now.
As far as the fees, maybe you can just discuss those.
Okay,
Yeah.
so at the last board meeting, Dave had and the board discussed lowering the original license fees. And I have gone in and done that, and they are ready. However, I didn't put them in the board packet because I was used to it being the second Monday. And my grandson sprained his ankle last week as a mess. So I did not put them in the packet, but they are ready. And also there was an education reg change for psychology that would allow APA programs to meet requirements without having in-residence coursework and allowing the in-residence to be where the school dictates that happen instead of on the campus.
And I think for that recommendation, that's on the agenda for this meeting for the board.
Is that one on there? Okay. I didn't put the reg in the packet. It was my concern, so.
But yeah, the last board meeting, the out-of-town board meeting in September, one of the big action items by the board was, while the fee fund balance is going down, there is a little bit of room right now that we could do. It's not something that we could maintain for forever, but maybe for several years, like 3 or 4 years, to decrease the amount for the initial license by $50, which is pretty significant. And so I think we can decrease that, and the board went ahead and voted to approve that last board meeting for the initial license fee. And then the exception is psychology, because their fee structure is a little bit different. So they have a higher application fee. So it'd be a $50 decrease for the application fee for psychology. And then the behavior analysts, they don't actually have an original license fee. It's just an application fee and then a renewal fee. And so, but the board had already voted earlier this year to decrease one of their fees as well by that amount, $50. So that will be included in this grouping of fee decreases. But I guess the question is, would you all like to see a copy of those regulations, or are you okay moving forward with those fee decreases as they were described by reducing those amounts by $50?
There was no other changes in the reg except those 2 fees.
I'd be fine with that.
You want formal or just consensus?
Let's go ahead and take a vote just to make sure.
Okay. All right, so we'll need a motion. Okay, second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion passed.
And the only other comments, you do have your historical table of permanent licenses broken out by license type, and then on the second page by profession. And again, happy to report, as has been the trend for a number of years, we're still continuing to see an increase in total number of licenses. So we are just a hair under 16,000. It's 15,997.
All right, I see Cindy's joined us. We'll do complaint review committee report.
Good morning. In your board packet, you have information from the Complaint Review Committee. On the sheet that is cases reviewed by the Complaint Review Committee, I wanted to point out that there were a significant number of cases that were tabled in October. This was due to some complicated and lengthy issues, and there is a special meeting that is scheduled for November. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't see anybody.
When is that November meeting?
I want to say November 13th, but that could be.
I'm looking.
That is
Okay, yeah, I see it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to professions reports, licensed psychology.
Yeah, and Richard was not able to be here for this meeting, but the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee did meet, and they did discuss the topic of regulation of artificial intelligence. Planning to discuss that further, and the advisory committee will meet next in December.
Thank you. Social work.
Yes, the Social Work Advisory Committee met on October 1st. And under old business, we reviewed descriptions of each level of social work to be placed on the BSRB website. And we kind of worked it as a group and came up with definitions that we will have final approval of the next time that we meet. We also discussed the revision of the clinical social work manual that is underway, and hopefully we'll have a final draft of that at our next meeting, which is going to be on December 10th.
Thank you. Professional counseling?
The professional counselors met the advisory committee met on October 7th. We spoke about the compact. We discussed artificial intelligence. And the most substantial thing that came out of our meeting was that we had a motion passed to recommend that half of the supervision hours required for clinical supervision stay with a board approved supervisor in counseling, and that half of those hours would then be allowed to be from other supervisors and other disciplines. So that was a big deal. We were able to figure that out. I'm glad about that. And our next meeting will be in December.
Thank you. Master's level psychology, the LMLP LCP advisory committee met on October 2nd. We continued discussion on the survey of licensees. Committee members had some suggestions and feedback about those questions. Also continued a discussion on the regulation of artificial intelligence. We had a couple committee members volunteer to work on adding a description for each profession on the BSRB website. We also discussed allowing individuals to take the ETTT early for clinical licensure, and started planning for issues we plan to discuss in 2025. Our next meeting is December 4th. Marriage and family therapy.
Yes, thank you. The Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee met on October 11th. We did have a presentation on artificial intelligence by Dr. Ben Caldwell. That was really interesting and thought-provoking there. We did continue to talk about the supervision requirements for MFT profession. We decided not to make a recommendation. We listened to the recommendation that was going to come from the professional counseling group, likely. As we encouraged our advisory committee to think about the supervision requirements and then discuss at our next meeting. And then also continue discussion on each profession, the professional description on the website. We will plan out our survey of licenses coming, and then, as we'll talk about in the meeting a little bit later, we have a recommendation about preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy, and making some recommendations to change language there. Our next meeting is December 13th.
Thank you. Addiction counseling.
The Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee has not met since our last board meeting. We met just before that meeting. Our next meeting is December 4th, and we plan at that time to welcome our 3 new advisory committee members as approved at the last in-person board meeting. We also will be discussing descriptions of each profession for the website, we will be discussing the questionnaire for licensees, and continue discussion on regulation of IAI, and I will plan to bring back the larger board's discussion of a possible master's level student temporary license that we discussed at our on-site planning meeting. Again, our next meeting is December 4th.
Thank you. Behavior analysis.
Yeah, we met on October 11th, and we watched the great thought-provoking video recording from the Marriage and Family Therapy Committee on AI. It was and it dovetailed quite nicely with the presentation. We welcomed 2 new board members. We continued our discussion on a possible survey for behavior analysts. And then we have we have on our agenda for new business to discuss a multi-state compact for behavior analysts and what that looks like and how those originate, where they go. And our next meeting will be December 13th at 1 o'clock, I assume.
Very good, thank you. We now have a 10-minute break scheduled. So back at 11:10. Thank you.
See you then.
Guess we'll give them a minute or two, looks like. You'll need to reset your clock.
Yeah,
Oh,
I did a couple of them this morning, but I missed that one.
I noticed the one in my car did
yeah.
correct itself, so I have to figure out how to do that.
Your
So
analog.
the annual resetting of the, learning how to set the clock in your car. My husband did mine, so I got lucky.
We have an SUV that will literally be right for just 1 minute, and then for whatever reason, it resets an hour off
Really?
or something in its internal logic that is forever messed up. Well, shall we?
I think there are, I see four board members on the Zoom, and then there's 4 in person, so that's 8. So we do have quorum, so.
There's none of them. All right. Next on our agenda would be
Big clock.
I was resetting my clock and trying to get it hung up.
next on our agenda is old business. Summary and update on action items from our out-of-town planning meeting on September 29th and 30th.
Okay, so I'll just go through some of the action items, just as kind of a recap. The board every year likes to hold an in-person meeting where the board can have more in-depth discussion on certain matters, and at least once a year kind of come together so the board members can interact in person. Although the hybrid nature of things is really helpful for us. And then there are certain items the board talks about for potential action items for a legislative agenda. So in the minutes from the previous meeting and your notes, you kind of see all the different topics that were covered. What the board decided to do for this year was to hold a meeting in Lawrence. That is a meeting that does move around to different locations. So 2 years ago, it was in Kansas City. Well, 3 years ago, it was hybrid or remote because of the pandemic. And then 2 years ago, it was in Kansas City. And last year, it was in Wichita, and this year, it was in Lawrence. So it has moved, and it might be in a new location next year. But the board decided to basically start the 2-day meeting on a Sunday evening, take care of some of the more of the traditional business items for the agency. And then the majority of the day on Monday could be focused on more of the items for the board's legislative agenda and items needing more in-depth discussion. So I'll just kind of focus primarily on some of those action items where the board talked about taking a different approach to certain things or things that are currently in progress, and give you some updates there. One item the board had previously discussed was the license verification portal and the inclusion of alias information on the BSRB license verification portal. And as was discussed, there had been some individuals contact the office and ask if that information could be removed. There were some discussion points about the need to protect the public, to make sure the public would be able to identify someone who had provided services to them, but maybe had changed their name. But then there was also a question of, if someone held this name but never practiced under it, is there a real value that you're adding in terms of the public protection? And so ultimately, what was determined, and I also reached out and talked to some individuals from other states to see kind of what their position on this was, and at least for a few of the states, they didn't include alias information on their verification portals. But we do have a need to know individuals' names while they are practicing in terms of their current legal name for sure, because that is what we have to use for our documentation purposes. And so upon request, the BSRB can provide the alias because it's really not legally protected information that we would be able, to hold under most circumstances. There might be some rare exceptions for things like if there was a previous domestic abuse case, or if there was something where someone was under a protective order. But with those rare exceptions, which we could deal with on a case-by-case basis, the idea is more of that we can indicate that there was an alias while they were practicing. And then upon request from an individual from the public, they could request that alias information. So I think that is the direction going forward. We're going to be talking to our licensing vendor to try to see if we can get that changed. But that is kind of the decision kind of moving forward. Another item that was talked about was advisory committee member expectations. So we have a policy on advisory committee membership, and a lot of that document is fairly short, it's a little over a page, and most of it talks about the role of the advisory committee as a body that makes recommendations back to the board. There is some language on there about how the advisory committee adds new members by reviewing applicant information, some things to consider in that process. But in terms of the expectations as a member of those committees, in terms of, how frequently would you be able to miss meetings, what the expectation is if you get a disciplinary violation, should you be a licensee, should you have to live in the state? The policy doesn't speak to any of those things specifically currently. So we did ask the board, should these things be addressed? There was also the discussion point of should each advisory committee potentially have the flexibility to decide this for themselves. And there was sort of a consensus that there should be an across the board standard in general in terms of what should be expected as an advisory committee member. And some of these items may be things that can be factored in when looking at applicants in terms of, are they living in the state and different things like that? Are they licensed? But one of the items that did have consensus was to add some language that would address disciplinary violations. Basically, in the expectations for board members document, it says it is the expectation that board members will not have disciplinary violations or get disciplinary violations. And this is different from complaints because you can't control if someone files a complaint. But it would be an expectation that members of the advisory committee would not be getting disciplinary violations. So the board asked me to put together some language in terms of if someone on an advisory committee does get disciplinary violation, that would be something that would be brought to the attention of the chair of the advisory committee and the chair of the board, and they would look into it to see if that person is suitable to continue on the advisory committee or not. The language currently exists that the chair of the board does have the authority to add members to the advisory committee or remove members. This would just kind of clarify that it's the expectation that advisory committee members would not get disciplinary violations and provide a little more clarity what would happen if someone got a violation. And I will plan to bring that back at a future meeting. Probably it will be the meeting in January. In terms of other new business, there was, I mentioned earlier, the Richard Nobles will be the new SIPAC commissioner following the SIPAC annual meeting at the end of November. And also for the social work compact, that compact allows there to be a backup commissioner. So in the event that the commissioner is unable to attend a meeting, two of the compacts allow there to be a backup, and Andrea Perdomo Morales was appointed by the board to be the backup commissioner for the social work compact. There were some recommendations that were forwarded to the board. One we've talked about as far as the EPPP and EPPP2 examination, and the board did vote to support the proposed bylaw amendment by Texas. And I mentioned what happened there in terms of the board letter afterwards, and then the eventual vote on that. And so that is where things are currently at. And the big takeaway is that that was just one mechanism that could have created a change, but the ultimate takeaway right now is that that will not be a requirement as of January 1st, 2026. And I'll provide updates as that committee forms and they talk about the test moving forward. There was a recommendation from the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee to request legislation to add a member of that profession to the statute that lists positions on the board. So currently it lists 8 professional members and 4 public members. And for the professional members, it specifically says 2 social workers and 2 addiction counselors and or 1 addiction counselor, 1 professional counselor, a master's level psychologist, 2 licensed psychologists, and a marriage and family therapist. So it does spell out each of the different professions and how many board members would be from those professions. There is not currently language to have a behavior analyst specifically. And so this would be basically adding a 13th board member. And so that is something the board did request in legislation a couple years ago. It was removed from committee, but the board did vote to go ahead and bring that back before the legislature on behalf of the board. And where it originated from was that Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee. In terms of other items, there was a recommendation, two recommendations from the Social Work Advisory Committee. And the bill that was passed last year by the legislature was put forward originally by the BSRB. It was Sub-Percent Bill 131. In that bill, there were several changes to licensure, a lot of different positive changes to really help individuals become licensed, to reciprocity and ways to make it easier for people to have their license back after they had a period where it had been expired and things like that. But there was an amendment by one of the committees to remove some of the coursework requirements for people pursuing clinical licensure as a social worker. And then there was also some hours that talked about this needed to be hours specifically in diagnosis and treatment. And that was changed. The language was not that there would be 1,500 hours of diagnosis and treatment under supervision, but instead the 1,500 hours would include but be not limited to diagnosis and treatment. So that's kind of some of the changes that were made. And so there did seem to be a desire for there to be individuals practicing at the independent level, at the highest level of licensure. But the concern from the Social Work Advisory Committee was that you're removing training and education on being able to diagnose and treat. But if these individuals become clinically licensed, independently licensed, they would be able to do that, even though they may not have had the sufficient education and training to do so. And so as a compromise and a solution to this, the two recommendations were to create a new level of licensure for the social work profession called an advanced generalist. And this is a license level that is offered in some other states. And also the second part of the recommendation was to restore those requirements for the coursework specifically in diagnosis and treatment, and cleaning up the language to make it specific those hours needed to be in diagnosis and treatment. And I think Leslie might be able to comment on this, but for the other professions that have the independent level of licensure, there is a similar statute for those professions that list similar coursework and similar requirements for those hours. Is that
That's correct, yes. All of the master's level working toward clinical have the 15 hours of clinical coursework that was required.
So right now, when you're looking at the different professions, the social work profession is the one that is not consistent with the other professions in terms of those qualifications for that independent level.
Yes.
And so this was a recommendation forwarded to the board at that meeting. We have been trying to work more with our associations at the state level. I mentioned that I had really tried to reach out to different groups to really start more of these conversational type meetings and see if we could work together. And so the board at the time tabled that motion and the recommendation and asked if we could try to set up a meeting with representatives from NASW Kansas to kind of work with them and see if we might be able to collaborate on something like this in front of the legislature. We did reach out to them, tried to explain that we wanted to have this as kind of a bigger meeting than just me as the director for the BSRB and the director of their association. We literally wanted to include some board members for the social work profession. Dave Anderson, as chair of the board, offered to attend the meeting as well. We wanted to reach out to more of the leadership of NASW Kansas and just try to get more dialogue and try to understand, you know, the different perspectives and concerns and see if we could work together on this. But unfortunately, there was a sort of a lack of availability, so we weren't able to identify a date since that meeting and this meeting. So unfortunately, we couldn't meet to talk about those topics. They did offer some availability later on in November, so we are still planning to meet and talk about these topics, but the board's position at the time was to table it, allow the conversation to happen, and then see if it could be revisited at this meeting. So that's where we are today. So that is still a recommendation pending before the board. So it is something for the board to consider. If you would like to have this be part of the legislation, that would be something that would go into a bill before the legislature. And so I wanted to bring that back to you with some additional details about the conversations that took place in between then and now.
Dave,
Yes.
I have it down that we have a meeting scheduled on November 25th with KNASW.
Yes.
Is that not accurate?
No, that is correct. Yeah.
Okay.
The board originally wanted to see if we
Right.
could meet in between the September and the November board meetings. But we weren't able to kind of fit that meeting in. So we do have a meeting later on this month. Just we couldn't meet before this meeting today. Yeah.
And so Dave, timing for introducing legislation, if the decision isn't made until the January board meeting, does that work out?
So it's a little tricky. We don't know exactly how the committee structure will work, because there is still the election, tomorrow. And, usually what happens is in December, leadership, has a meeting at the Capitol and they determine, leadership for both the House and the Senate, and then, both parties. And then they start looking at appointments for chairs. And so, at least on the House side, the former chair of the Health Committee is not running for re-election. So we anticipate there's going to be some change there. The reason I bring that up is just I have a general sense of how the previous chair worked bills and to get things, sometimes to do the Office of the Reviser of Statutes, you needed to have things in by a certain time frame. I just don't know how it's going to operate with new chairs and new members of those committees. I know that what I could do in advance is kind of draft up any language that we would want to talk about. And then I could bring that back for the board to vote on at the January meeting. It's just depending on how many other bills are before the revisers at that point, it might impact the ability for it to get released before certain legislative deadlines. So maybe I should pause there and see if the board has any desire to go ahead and move forward with that recommendation, or what the thought is on that item.
I still think it's a good idea to have the meeting first and have some dialogue and before we move forward with any other recommendation.
I agree with that.
I am concerned about not waiting, however, because it could very likely mean that we have to wait another year before we can propose that. So far, I understand there haven't been any training plans for LSCSW that have not included the diagnostic and treatment hours that have normally been required. But within the next year, if we have to wait another year, that could certainly happen. So I understand the uncertainty of the change in leadership and not knowing when we could possibly introduce a bill, but
Yeah,
I have that concern.
One option could potentially be, if the board is open to it, we could try to have a short meeting in December, purely, for the purpose of just getting a final pass at some of the items that could go into legislation. That would also give us a little bit more time to work on some of these items. It's been kind of a very packed month in between the last 2-day meetings. So.
Dave, I know everybody will be busy, but I certainly would support that option that you just mentioned.
Likewise.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. And maybe we can just consider this item tabled, and then we'll try to have a special meeting for the purpose of, revisiting this after we meet with representatives from NASW Kansas, and then we can bring any other legislative items at that point to the medical language form. Okay. In the meanwhile, I will send out a poll to try to get an idea of availability, and then identify that to go ahead and put it on calendars. In terms of some other items, there was a recommendation from the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee that had to do with the preparing for the practice of addiction counseling. This has to do with the Construction of Act statute that basically says, students and interns they don't have to be licensed when they're working in certain settings. But it also said students, interns, and individuals preparing for the practice of addiction counseling. And that preparing for the practice of addiction counseling, there didn't seem to be a consensus on what that was actually referring to and who fell into that category. And we want to be pretty clear in terms of not having something set up where individuals could practice without a license. As a public protection agency, it's very important that we make sure that we can regulate these professions. And so the recommendation for the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee was to remove that language from the statute. And it was also noted the similar language was in the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee statutes. And so they were going to be reviewing that as a committee. But the board did vote to go ahead and include that as part of the legislative item to strike the language for the addiction counseling profession. Next item had to do with addiction counseling and the student temporary addiction counseling licenses. And basically, this was something that was started by the BSRB. It was an effort to help individuals get into the workforce and be able to start providing services a little bit earlier on. It requires 60 hours in addiction or with the emphasis in addiction counseling or a related field. And you have to be have an agreement with an employer in a specific employment setting, also with your school, and you have to be pursuing coursework towards completing your degree. Ultimately, this is looked at as sort of a bridge between people who are students and ultimately becoming a licensed addiction counselor. And so we have heard requests for additional flexibility in terms of people who are may not have had the coursework on the undergraduate level in addiction counseling or related field, but are requesting more flexibility if they're currently enrolled in an addiction specific program. And the board was supportive in terms of adjusting the language on that to allow some individuals in that category to be eligible as well. So. And then in terms of some other items, we did provide some updates on just licensing in general. And we're happy to report that the timeframe for licensing applicants, when you're looking at a real high level, that has improved. We've become more efficient going between fiscal year 22 and 23, and also going between 23 and 24. We also tried to kind of walk through the licensing process for the board, showing a little bit of what things are under our control time-wise and which ones are not. For example, some of the associations, when someone takes their licensing examination, we can pull those scores really quickly, or they send them to us very fast. Other professions, unfortunately, it can take a month or longer for them to actually report the official score to us. So somebody could have taken the test, passed it, but until we get that official score, we're not able to move them forward. So a couple of the takeaways from this is we're going to try to have more conversations with those groups, see if we can speed up that time frame and see if there are more efficiencies we can find there. And also, we want to go ahead and take those examples and put something on the website as a little 2-page handout that kind of helps applicants see the different steps towards licensure, so they can kind of get a better sense of where things are at, where they're at in the process. And so we're working on cleaning those types of things up and putting something on the website so people can have a kind of a cleaner resource for them. In terms of other items, so there was the discussion on supervision, and that'll be coming up for professional counseling under the new business items for this meeting. Marriage and family therapy was also going to be discussing supervision. There was also discussion on a new regulation for an expedited application review process. We got some really good dialogue with board members in terms of priorities and how that process would work. So we'll be writing up some of that language and having that be for every license type under the BSRB. And then in terms of some other items, there was conversation about a regulation from Texas that would give their state more ability to offer remediation if someone is deficient in terms of a license requirement. That's not in the statute, but it's in the regulation. And we were looking at it to see if this might be something the board would be interested in for Kansas. And the board did want that language to be a little bit more concentrated on what Kansas would have. But I've had some conversations with Tim, legal counsel for the board, following that meeting. And for most of the professions, there is a provisional licensure statute. And a lot of what we have used that statute for in the past has been a provisional license when someone is short of a course or educational qualifications. But the language in that statute goes a bit further. It really does talk about the quantity or the quality of the education, and some of the deficiencies might be able to be addressed through that provisional licensure statute that's already in place. So we're going to be taking a closer look at that to see if maybe that will be something the board could start using even more quickly than putting in place a new regulation. So, in terms of other items, the board did support moving forward with a modification to legislation that would provide a path for academic programs or individuals to pay a fee to get an assessment of a program. Right now, we have some schools that reach out to us and say, does our program meet the requirements for licensure? But the use of our staff time is really dedicated towards people that have applied for licensure, and that's how our fee structure is set up. Someone applies, they provide the fee, and in a sense, that goes towards the staff time to look at all those qualifications. Someone from the outside as a program, we totally understand why they would want that assurance. We're just not set up to really offer that as cleanly. But Missouri has a statute that allows people to pay a fee and get a similar assessment on behalf of the program or individual. So the board was supportive of going ahead and putting that in place too. Additionally, there is a disciplinary statute that allows the board the ability to put conditions on a license. But some of the reasons that we might be able to condition a license have to do with committing unprofessional conduct or having committed a felony in the past or something like that. But there are instances to where an individual applicant for licensure, there may be concerns about meriting the public trust that really don't go to the level of being a disciplinary violation. And so there are mechanisms the board can use to condition a license, but to make the process more clean, it would be helpful if we could add language to that statute to make it very clear the board has the authority to offer conditions on a license and things that don't necessarily get towards a disciplinary violation. So the board was supportive looking at some additional language on it. And then, as I mentioned, we're moving towards CE broker. As part of that process, there is now a portal for the social work profession that they can have individual providers apply to become a board approved supervisor or a board approved provider of CEs. And they're the only profession that currently has that in statute. But we think now that we have this mechanism with CE broker, it would be a good opportunity to open this up to other professions as well, if they would like to voluntarily, pay a fee to be group providers. And so the board was supportive of that as well. So we're going to be putting together some language on that for the other professions. And then as a small minor note, there are two very similar professional counseling fee statutes. This happened because the compact was passed and some of the language in that was different than our normal fee statute. And normally they do a reconciliation where they just put the two bills together and clean up some of the terms that may have been slightly different. This time they didn't. They left two almost identical fee statutes with just different language. And they don't both include the same types of fees. So as part of our legislation, we'll probably need to look at those two and combine them both back to make sure people don't get confused and miss one of the fees that's in the statute. And then I guess the other last item I just will comment on in terms of the BSRB fees, as was reported earlier, we talked a little bit about the fee fund balance where we're currently at, that the balance is going down, but there may be some additional room for fee decreases in the short term. And so the board did vote to decrease initial licensure fees by $50. The licensed psychology fee for applications would be decreased by $50 instead. And so I'm happy to do that. That is something we can put forward in the regulations. The board learned on that earlier. So we have had some questions by some of the budget committees about our fee structure, and the board has really tried to be responsive to those. We've done investigations about other states, and what we have found is that most of our fees are on the low end when you're looking at other states. We really don't charge very much. And one of the things I didn't mention for the ASPPB conference was a lot of those different licensing boards in psychology from other states are independent boards, and they have to have their fees higher because they're trying to, license one profession with fewer licenses than we have under the BSRB. But by combining resources and having 7 professions, we really do see a lot of efficiency with being able to share staff, share resources like having one copy machine and things like that. So it really has helped us be efficient. And one hurdle that we have here that a lot of states don't is by statute, we contribute 10% of our revenue to the state general fund. So that's a requirement. And some other similar states, like let's say Missouri, they don't have that same requirement. So part of the reason our fees can't be lower is because of that mandatory contribution. So, but we really have been thinking creatively to try to address their concerns. And I'm happy to bring that forward on behalf of the board. So, but those are the items that I had down. We just wanted to give you an update in terms of those decisions and then which ones still need additional work. Since we are planning to have that special meeting in December, we can bring back the actual language for that draft statute. And in the meanwhile, I can start putting that together and drafting up those sections.
Very good. Thank you, Dave. Any questions for Dave? All right, seeing none, we'll move to update on proposed changes to regs.
Yes, and the first one on here is continuing education. You do have a copy of 3 of the continuing education regulations in your packet. And so I might turn it over to Leslie Allen, the Director and Licensing Manager for the BSRB, and she can talk about those draft regulations that you see in your packet.
So the continuing education regulations, I have went through and tried to make them all the same as far as the number of hours. But there is one area that I hesitated to change for psychology. For the psychology and master's level psychology, the scientific, writing a scientific or professional paper or book chapter, you get 15 hours per paper, and they have psychology actually said 45 originally and 50 was their max. That doesn't really work because you can't do your diagnosis or your ethics using that category. So I lowered it to 30, and LMLP has it at 20. And then the others have 10. And so I wanted to ask the master's level and psychology members of the board if, because of the profession, if that is something that needs to stay at that high number. I didn't know if it can be made equal or if the other professions feel like they could do more in that area. I just wanted to get a feel for that before I finish that completely.
The total number of hours needed for LMLP, LCP, and LP are all higher. Right?
They're at 40. MFT is at 40 as well.
I can't think of any reason to. How often does that get used?
You know, I don't look at it a lot unless there's an audit. There's a question about the paper. So I can't say for sure. I don't know, some of the things in, just they were easy to lower and make more even, but that one was way off. So Linda, do you have any?
I'm trying to look at it. When does this need to be done by? And is this something we can bring to the advisory committee for discussion?
You could. I was trying to get them ready so we could put them through, but if it's something that the committees need to discuss, that's, certainly an option.
I think that there would probably be a lot of opinions on that.
Mm-hmm. That's why I didn't mess with it too much.
Did there used to be 60 hours of CE required for psychologists?
So their number right now is 50 and they're going down to 40. Initially, when everyone cut theirs, like when social work went from 60 to 40, psychology was 100.
Oh, okay. So the 45 hours made sense then when you have to have that
It
many.
might,
CE.
yeah. I don't know if it got lowered at that time because that was so long ago. I could probably find it somewhere, but.
Yeah, as part of the review for the CEs too, we did look to see what are the standard number of hours required by profession in different states. And seems like we were not the highest, but we were on the higher end with 50 for psychology and master's level psychology. So both of those committees recommended decreasing down from 50 to 40, which is more in line with the majority of programs. And social work, it was on the high end with 40. And so there was a recommendation to decrease that down from 40 to 30. For some of the other professions, we looked to see where we were at. We were right in line with the majority of states. Like marriage and family therapy, I think the number of hours we require is the same number, and professional counseling is the same number that most states require. So some of the professions had recommended changes to get in line with the other states, and then some did not because they already were in line.
So Leslie, if you, it seems to me, and of course, I don't feel like I have the authority to speak definitively on this.
Mhm.
However, 30 CEs for a publication category, that'd be 2 publications a year. That to me, or 1 each year for the
Mhm.
cycle. But the next item, 6, like a maximum of 40 CEs shall be allowed. That also doesn't allow for the requirement of ethics and diagnostics.
Let me pull up my, sorry. I was looking at my Excel spreadsheet, so.
Yeah,
Um,
it's on page 3.
the,
Right
so
underneath.
six, you can use an academic course for ethics and diagnosis and treatment.
Okay, so it would be, so when you're categorized, so when the applicant or the recertification is in progress, they would note 15 continuing ed or 40 continuing ed for taking an academic course, of which 3 was ethics and 3 diagnostics were included.
Yes,
So-
they would have, they could show that. If they could show that, they could use the course.
Okay.
to meet
And
everything.
they cannot do that for like writing a paper on ethics or?
No, currently it says they can do it in 1, 2, 4, and 6. And I will, and that's been there, that's not, so
Right.
workshops, first time preparation and presentation. And documented completion of a self-study course, which is really a workshop
Right.
online as long as there's a post-test. And I was gonna update that language to be more consistent with the regs. And then completion of an academic course. That's the only way that they're supposed to.
Is the LP regs included in the packet?
No, but I have it, I can send
Oh,
it to you.
Yeah, these were not exhaustive of all the changes. It was sort of an example of some of the changes.
It seems.
Well,
proportional.
I can go on record of saying that I think 30 CEs for a professional paper or book chapter sounds reasonable to me, especially since that they don't have the opportunity to double dip on that one like they do on 1, 4, and 6. But I think it should be discussed at the advisory committee.
What do you mean double dip?
Well, that they can count that. They can count that 30 CEs for, or they can count the 40 CEs for completing an academic course as their ethics and their diagnostics and treatment. So it's serving 2 functions, right? I'm getting my full CEs that I need by taking this course, but it also qualifies for diagnostics and ethics, whereas number 5 doesn't. So I think that should be discussed at committee.
Unless maybe the paper or the chapter, if the paper or the chapter was on diagnosis or ethics.
Yeah, except for it's not written that way right now.
Yeah, which I found interesting because it can be done in a first time preparation and presentation of a course.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
kind of-
so I think I think there's 2 questions. Number 1 is reducing the max number of CEs that you can get for publication and professional presentation or book chapters, et cetera, from 45 to 30. But the second question, I think, is because we have to open this up to make these changes, right?
Yeah.
whether or not we should insert the language in number 5 to have that also be eligible to serve as, if they write a paper on ethics or they write a paper on the newest edition of the DSM-5 and what that means for diagnostics, that should be able to count. So I think those two questions should be discussed. Thank you, Leslie, for doing this.
You're welcome. So, I lowered things from, for 40 hours, they get 12 hours. The people who have 30 hours, is 10. So like workshops, seminars, academic courses, self-study with a post-test, all of those things, you can get all your CEUs that way. Self-study without a post-test is 8 for people, for the professions with 30 and 10 for 40. Providing supervision is 10 and 12. MFT has the addition of supervision for 8 hours. First time presentation and preparation, I made 15 and 20 hours. Holding office is 8 and 10. And participation in quality care, which was added to some because it was not in all professions, is 8 and 10. And then the scientific paper, and then receiving personal psychotherapy is also in psychology and master's level psychology, but not in the others. But it has to be part of a designated training program. It's not just going for therapy. None of the committees had expressed the option of having that. I don't know that they knew it was an option, so I don't, but that is there for the two psychology professions. So we'll take them back to the committees and have them review them and discuss that.
And that'll happen in time for you to be able to put it forward, right? Because our committee meets in the beginning of December.
So these are in the regulations, so we can bring forward changes to regulations anytime.
Okay.
So we have a little more flexibility with that. It's just well, one of the reasons we had initially started looking into these is because they hadn't been updated in quite a bit of time. So we thought some cleanup would be helpful, and then we started looking at the other items too. So
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Next is the unprofessional conduct.
okay, so as you may recall, the board and advisory committees have done quite a bit of work in terms of updating the unprofessional conduct regulations. Over the last month, I've been working with one of our staff members here to take all of the initial comments and then sort of all of the second wave of recommended changes and comments from the advisory committees and putting all those additional edits into a big packet of those. And then the last bit will be looking to see, for some of the professions, there was a separate unprofessional conduct that had to do with documentation. And I think for this, we're working on having a copy for you that would at least include that as an option for each of the professions. And so for those big items, we want to make sure that if you would like it to be standard across the different professions, that is something that can be addressed in all of them. So what I wanted to just kind of bring to your attention is that those have been worked on behind the scenes. I think now, between now and the next meeting, we'll be able to send you a copy of those edits so we can have a good discussion on what the board would like us to move forward with for the official ones that would go out for public comment.
Very good. Any questions about that? I guess that moves us to new business. Recommendations from advisory committees. Start with Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee and preparing for practice.
And Mary, do you want me to talk about this one, or do you want
Sure, either way.
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, this is just very similar to the recommendation that was made by the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee. The Practice Act describes, under 65-6409, which is in your packet, it says nothing in the Marriage and Family Therapist Licensure Act shall be construed, and then under A, to prevent marriage and family therapy practiced by students or interns or individuals preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy, to practice under qualified supervision of a professional, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the issue is not the students or interns reference, it's really more to the vague reference to individuals preparing for the practice of, in this instance, marriage and family therapy. And so basically the marriage and family therapy had heard this, heard the recommendation by the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee, and similarly, the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee recommended to the board striking this reference from the statute for consistency and to kind of clear up any kind of vagueness there. I guess the item would be for the board. Does the board want to go ahead and recommend this change from the advisory committee?
So we need a motion.
You could do a motion.
I mean, I'll certainly make this motion.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion passed. Next, Professional Counseling Advisory Committee Supervision Recommendation.
And Laura, do you want me to talk about this or do you want to?
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so in your packet of material, you have a copy of KAR, Kansas Administrative Regulation 102-3-7A. And what this regulation talks about is postgraduate supervised professional experience required to be licensed as a clinical professional counselor. And under section C, on page 2, it describes some of the qualifications that someone would need to be able to provide supervision to someone accruing hours towards a clinical license. And the real focus on this has been item C, or C3, which says under extenuating circumstances approved by the board, a clinical supervisor may be a person who is licensed at the graduate level, to practice in one of the behavioral sciences, and whose authorized scope of practice permits the independent practice of counseling, therapy, or psychotherapy. The qualifying individual shall not have had less than 2 years of clinical practice beyond the qualifying licensure date when the individual provided clinical supervision. And the previous test, so just a few years ago, the board opened things up in terms of supervision. And previously, a lot of the supervision had been provided in person, in the physical presence of someone. And at that time, the regulation talked about the test, looked at availability of someone in terms of a clinical professional counselor. And so if someone was available, you could get the supervision from that person. If they were not available, then you could have more flexibility to find someone outside of that profession. But with it opened up to be able to provide supervision by televideo, the test has changed. And now you need to show an extenuating circumstance that has to be approved by the board for you to essentially go outside of the professional counseling profession to find someone to provide that supervision. And so what we are hearing from the Kansas Counseling Association and the advisory committee is a strong desire for professional counselors to receive supervision by professional counselors. What we are hearing in other avenues is from employers who are saying it would be helpful for us to be able to have other individuals provide that supervision. And we would like increased flexibility for exceptions on who can provide that supervision. It's a workforce type issue. It's going to help us bring more people in and be able to compensate them in better ways. And so we are hearing from both sides about the importance of supervision by counselors, and then also the requests about more increased flexibility for other professions. And so this was taken to the advisory committee as an option. One thing that was discussed, and I brought this up, was that potentially there could be a proposition put forward where half of the hours that are required to get a supervision would still need to be someone who was a professional counselor, and then potentially half could be by someone who was at least holding the level of license and had the education appropriate. So that way there would still be the supervision provided, at least in part, by a professional counselor, but also some flexibility to assist individuals in the workforce. And so that was voted on by the advisory committee and as a recommended change. And so that was the recommendation brought back to the board for discussion.
Any questions from anybody? It felt like a good compromise.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah, I think it does sound like a good compromise, and I think where the MFT advisory committee was just sort of thinking about things was, I think this is one of those areas where I would anticipate some other advocacy and pushback when we propose language changes. So not that that changes the advisory committee's thought process on it, but I do think it's something that we should be aware of in terms of potential outcomes for these changes.
And that was something that was discussed in the advisory committee as well, is that, you know, the advisory committee had initially talked and looked at, should there be a change? And the initial recommendation several months ago was, you know, keep this current test and to have the supervision be provided by professional counselors. And KCA's position was very clear that they really thought the supervision should come from counselors as well. And they wrote a letter to the board on behalf of that. And so, but like you said, you know, there are other individuals with other priorities, other groups, and we want to be mindful to that. And so, should there be any kind of legislative action, this is something the board can put forward to try to reach a compromise type position. I guess the question before the board is, would you like to support this recommendation brought to you from the advisory committee?
Any other
I-
comments? The requirement for extenuating circumstances being approved by the board. Do we know what that process would look like?
Yeah, so extenuating circumstances is defined by the board. It talks about an extreme condition that makes compliance with the requirement either impossible or inadvisable. And so it really does call for an extreme reason why someone wouldn't be able to meet the requirements. And so in the past, one of the exceptions has been, let's say someone employed at the VA, where they have a specific requirement that someone has to get supervision on site. And if they don't have someone employed there, it really ties the hands of the individual. So there have been instances like that that have met that standard, but it is a high bar. It is a higher bar than probably availability, but it does call for an extreme reason why it wouldn't normally be a professional counselor.
Would you say it's pretty infrequent that those requests are coming in? They certainly seem a lot fewer than they used to.
No, it is not.
It is not.
It is not, but the board has made decisions on certain situations, so we don't have to bring it to the board.
I see. So the decision tree is just
Yeah, it's
more
been,
branches in there.
yes.
Okay.
Because we've had requests, but when the requests are similar and the board has put forward a position, then we let them know, well, this is the consistent position. Unless there is something that would just be unique that we would want to bring forward and have that be addressed. But otherwise, we've tried to basically say that the consistent position has been this on similar things. So we are still getting requests from people for exceptions. But in general, we've given them kind of the same description, see if they can evaluate it by that process. And most of the people are either doing this for financial reasons, and the board specifically weighed in on that and said financial reasons were not an extreme reason under the extenuating circumstances definition. So that didn't fit. And a matter of preference, just a matter of preference is not an extreme condition either. There really would need to be something different that would call for that bar.
Point of clarification, would you change the language under 3, or is this a standalone recommendation that says the postgraduate supervised hours would be 50%?
Changing the language, isn't it?
There would be some language changes, yeah.
Under 3.
Yeah, and probably other places too.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it isn't just under the extenuating circumstances. I just wanted to clarify that.
No.
Thank you.
No, I think under this new proposal, as opposed to having any of the supervision met, it would be more of, well, I think we have also talked about, you know, you have items 1, 2, and 3. 2 doesn't really fit in terms of the previous, number two is if a licensed clinical professional counselor is not available, the clinical supervisor may be a person who's qualified by educational coursework and degree for licensure as a clinical professional counselor in Kansas who has at least 5 years of postgraduate professional experience in clinical professional counseling. That standard really people don't use. So
We were gonna delete that.
but number one is the avenue for the licensed clinical professional counselor. Item 3 is really the one that opens it up to people who are qualified otherwise. And so if this recommendation moves forward, it would really be some different language, and we want to put this in a statute too, that kind of clarifies this. And that basically, without meeting the extenuating circumstances, you could have half of your hours by someone who's a clinical professional counselor, and then half by someone who had the right training and education from another profession.
Thank you.
And then if they did meet the extenuating circumstances, they could have it all from somebody from another profession.
I think that is an option. I don't know that there's any kind of discussion on that.
Oh, I guess what currently is in.
Yeah, currently that language does allow that for all of it if they did meet that bar.
And that would remain.
If that's something the board would like to do, we can definitely do that. This wasn't part of the original recommendations.
Just trying to get it right there. Right.
I like the idea of keeping the extenuating circumstance bar. To me, that needs to be separate than the movement to half the hours.
So maybe have something that would say half the hours will need to be by someone who's in the professional counseling profession. And then up to half the hours could be by someone from other professions. And then under extenuating circumstances, all the hours could be provided by somebody who was, outside the professional counseling profession. So I think if you're okay with this, since it came from your committee, would you be okay with modifying the recommendation and match that?
Any additional comments? See any? Do you want a motion?
Thanks.
I'll make that motion.
Okay,
Thank you.
second,
Second.
okay. So we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, sign. Motion carries.
Thank you.
Next, we have licensed psychology, advisory committee, educational requirement.
Yes, and this is in your packet as well. It is KAR 102-1-12, educational requirements for the licensed psychologist profession. And there were 2 recommendations that were forwarded that would change the ability for individuals to meet the qualifications for licensure. And Leslie, feel free to jump in on this as well. For licensed psychology, currently what it states is that someone needs to receive their education from an APA accredited program or meet substantial equivalent requirements that are in the regulation. But even if someone received their education from APA accredited program, the regulation currently says that they also need to satisfy the specific coursework that's listed in the regulation. So one of the recommendations would be that as long as they did attend and graduate from an APA accredited program, those individuals wouldn't specifically have to meet the educational coursework. That's really reserved for the people trying to meet the substantial equivalent path.
That's correct. And there's a copy if you want there of the amended regulation. I put it in the board packet
Do you know when you put it in there?
just now, earlier.
Let me go ahead and I'll try to pull that up on my screen and share that here.
It's in red in your packet and folder.
So not in the board packet.
Right, in the file
I
named
see.
regs. I added the ones that I didn't send you.
102-1-12.
Mhm.
And for those of you, I'll share my screen here in a second. I realize you probably may not be able to see this. Let's make this a little bit bigger. Okay.
And then all the changes are in B, I believe. Little b.
Okay, so you should be able to see a copy of 102-1-12. And you said D or B?
Oh, B.
Okay, so basically the language that would be struck under this recommendation previously said, or currently states, if the applicant began the program after March 10th, 2006, the accredited program shall require that at least 24 semester credit hours in the substantive areas identified in such paragraph, or the equivalent number of quarter or trimester credit hours be completed while the applicant is in residence. So this requirement of that coursework and that it be in residence would be essentially struck from that section B.
Right.
So essentially, it just has to be an APA accredited program.
Right. Which would be consistent with all the other professions now.
Yeah, and I assume with the compact, that would make it kind of clear in terms of what they're gonna require as well. Or is there's strictly license based?
For the SEPAC compact?
Yeah.
I don't know, this might have been, every state can kind of set their own standards, so I don't know if this would affect the compact specifically, but it definitely wouldn't hurt us in terms of the compact.
But no, to my knowledge, no other state has any requirement of coursework in residence for APA programs. They don't have that additional requirement, they just use APA.
Yeah.
Are there other edits after
Yeah.
this?
And then in number 2 up above, I'm sorry, it's just one small, in residence, that the physical location identified by the institution instead of at the university, because they don't all have a campus.
So this was kind of requested because there are some individuals that may be able to meet a requirement of having some of the training be physically in person. But if there is no campus, this would essentially allow a academic institution to identify a physical location, and as long as the number of hours in the physical presence or the training took place, it just changes it from the current definition of having to be at the institution to a physical location identified by the institution.
And the psychology committee discussed that because there are APA accredited programs that don't have a campus, and this would be more in line with those rules as well.
Yeah, there is still the requirements that it be in person. So to my knowledge, I don't believe any APA accredited programs for licensed psychology are totally remote. I think there is still that requirement of about at least 1 year or something equivalent of that being physically in the presence.
They meet at different locations throughout the United States.
Which allows for a breadth of experience.
So that issue's though still in the rates for LMLP.
Yes, because the current definition of in residence is the same as what it was for the other professions before they made the change. So
Because we've had some non-APA PhD programs try to come down and get licensed through LMLP, and that's been one of the issues that's
Right. So if you discussed it, yes, this is still a requirement, but yours is with faculty.
yeah, master's level is a little tricky, and they did talk about that at the ASPPB meeting recently, because APA is starting to look at accredited master's level programs, but some of the criteria they're looking for, historically, I think only about 17 states license master's level psychologists, but there is a movement to doing that more. It's just there's different standards, different terminology. It doesn't really mean the same between one state and another. So,
well, they have the bar of the APA accreditation now.
Right.
So that's why I think it still makes some sense in our.
Right.
And that's what we discussed, because to be in line with how some current APA accredited universities operate. Like David said earlier, they don't all have a campus where somebody could come for that residency, but that program identifies what they have deemed an appropriate location to obtain this particular requirement. And then the next section is somewhat of a redundancy, where if we're going to say we're going to, if a student or an applicant goes through an APA accredited program, we're going to accept that. And that second section on here gets rid of the redundancy that says we will accept APA accreditation, but in addition to that, we're going to have our staff go through and make sure that it included all these different elements, right? So this section here is redundant or superfluous to saying we're going to accept APA accreditation. And then the section right above just clearly delineates that we are going to adhere to what the APA has deemed an appropriate residency.
I guess the question for the board, like the other recommendations, is would you like to take any action on this recommendation?
To allow the regulation to move forward in the process.
So is this where I make a motion to allow that to move forward?
Yes, you could make a motion.
I so move.
Very good. Second. That was you, David? Very good. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Next under new business is the appointment of board members to hearing panels for licensing hearings.
So we have had 2 requests for hearings coming up. And so in the past, we've asked for individual volunteers, but I think between the hearing that we are in the process of scheduling and the other 2, it will involve all the members of the board. So Tim, as long as you don't see an issue with this, is there a way for the board chair to just appoint the board members to serve on hearing panels, and then we can pull availability and then see who's available on certain dates?
Yeah, I think that's fine as long as there's no objection from any member.
You mean for the specific request?
Right. So in the past, we've tried to say, you know, we have a professional counselor applicant, and we would still meet the requirements the board had decided on in the past, where they would want the, you know, in that instance, the professional counseling board member, a public board member, and then the other 3 could be any types of board members. But instead of saying these specific 5 have to be for this one or these specific 5, since now we will need all board members to serve on at least one of those. If we have a general appointment, then we can look for availability, and then that's going to be helpful for us to be able to group those people on one.
And so was Tim's point, though, that if somebody said, I can't serve on that particular one, as long as they were able to do that.
No,
Yeah.
more to the process. I mean, as long as no member has an objection to, I mean, if all will be considered, and then you're going to, Mr. Chair, you know, determine what the composition will be. As long as no member has an objection to that process, then we can move forward that way.
That's fine with me.
Everybody all right with that?
Makes sense.
Anybody opposed? All right. Next item is a note on the annual performance evaluation for the executive director.
Okay. So the expectations of board members document does the executive director shall have an annual performance review by the board. And a few years back, we talked about that process and put together sort of a template so that board members could receive that, fill out the information, and then provide it back to, in the past, what has worked is it provides back to the chair of the board. And then essentially that is all kind of combined. And then what has worked in the past is that the chair of the board would have the performance review with the executive director after all the comments had been collected and kind of grouped together. So I just kind of wanted to bring that back to the board to see if that's the process you'd like to use this going forward. And I'd be happy to kind of provide a little bit of information as far as some of the roles that I do that may not be as visible as others to kind of help you in the process too. So.
Yeah, if I may, I think the process has worked really well. The document that Dave prepares was really helpful in that process to pull together the things from his document and then the board member feedback. At any level, Dave, if you'd like my assistance, because I've done that now a couple of times, I'd be happy to help with that as well.
Great, thank you.
And should there be a need for an executive session, that can definitely be something that takes place at a following meeting too, if there's additional comments or something comes up in that process too. So I'm gonna let you know all the options you have.
So that go out to board members.
Yeah, if you could give me, let's say, 2 weeks, I can put together that report for you all. And then that way you can have that information while you're doing the other evaluations.
And I have a template form that I've sent out previously to board members, so I can forward that to you. And
Everybody all right with that?
yes.
Well, that brings us to the end of our agenda. Date for the next regular board meeting, January 13th. Also, just a reminder that there's likely to be a special board meeting in December to talk about some of the issues we've discussed today. You'll send out some poll for that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all again for your.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Do we have a schedule of meetings in 2025?
So we can talk about that for a second. It seems like in the past, in general, the board meetings have been the second Monday of the month, every other month. So starting in January and then kind of continuing forward unless there is a conflict like a holiday or there's a real reason to move the meeting. But that has been the traditional date. So
And the Kappa meetings are,
those tend to be the fourth Tuesday of the month from 8:30 until about 9:30.
thank you.
And as long as those still work for everyone, we can go ahead and start sending out Zoom appointments to put on your calendars.
Thanks.
And are we gonna have a Kappa meeting when we're done with this?
Yes, so members of the board, after this meeting officially adjourns, we'll go ahead and end the broadcast. And then I will send out an email with a separate Zoom link. And then just go ahead and follow that for the meeting under the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act. So that's not a public board meeting, but yeah, keep an eye out for your email and then we'll just start that up just a few minutes after we adjourn the public board meeting.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You want to do a motion to adjourn?
Yeah, motion to adjourn.
So
So moved. All in favor?
Bye.
Aye.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks, everyone.
I'm doing it like I'm gonna log on.
I am so glad you put it on the agenda because when I was driving here this morning, I was like, we need to talk about Dave's review.